Since you have been going to school, you were taught the following things. An atom consists of 3 subatomic particles. Protons, the positively charged particles that are found in the nucleus or the center of the atom. Neutrons, the non-charged or neutral particles that are also found in the nucleus or center. And electrons, the negatively charged particles found orbiting the nucleus. But how did this come about? Well, through many years of discoveries, the model of the atom actually changed. Even the one shown in the picture here is actually incorrect. Let's look through the history and see how the model of the atom was actually formed. In 400 BC, a Greek philosopher named Democritus wrote that all matter is made up of atoms, little round things called spheres. He also said that atoms are so small you can't divide them up. And the third thing he said was, atoms are so small that they are invisible. So everyone stuck with that theory for 2,200 years, until we entered what is called the start of the atomic age. In 1803, an English scientist named John Dalton proposed what he called his atomic theory. He stated the following things. 1. He said elements are made of extremely small spheres called atoms. 2. All atoms of a particular type of element are identical to each other. In other words, all the gold atoms are identical to other gold atoms. 3. Atoms of each element were different from each other. So oxygen atoms are different than carbon atoms. You can see he drew this out in his notebook here. 4. Compounds consisted of atoms joining together in the same ratio every time. So CO2 is always going to be made up of 1 carbon and 2 oxygen. Or water is always made up of 2 hydrogen and 1 oxygen atom. This model of the atom stood for close to 100 years until in 1897, J.J. Thomson discovered electrons doing work with cathode ray tubes.
A cathode ray tube is the forerunner of the television tube. It is a glass tube from which most of the air has been evacuated. When the 2 metal plates are connected to a high voltage source, the negatively charged plate, called the cathode, emits an invisible ray. The cathode ray is drawn to the positively charged plate, called the anode, where it passes through a hole and continues traveling to the other end of the tube. When the ray strikes this specially coated surface, the cathode ray produces a strong fluorescence, or bright light. When an electric field is applied across the cathode ray tube, the cathode ray is attracted by the plate bearing positive charges. Therefore, a cathode ray must consist of negatively charged particles. We know these negatively charged particles as electrons. A moving charged body behaves like a tiny magnet, and it can interact with an external magnetic field. The electrons are deflected by the magnetic field. As expected, when the direction of the external magnetic field is reversed, the beam of electrons is deflected in the opposite direction.
Because this showed a new model of the atom, the old model had to change. So Thomson suggested that the atom was completely positive and the electrons were scattered all throughout the atom. This became known as the plum pudding model because it reminded Thomson of an English dessert of the same name. The Thomson model stood for about a decade. Then another scientist, trying to actually prove Thomson's model was correct, tried a different experiment called the gold foil experiment. And this scientist's name was Ernest Rutherford. Rutherford was going to use radioactive alpha particles that were only allowed to escape through a tiny hole in a box and then shoot the radioactive particles at a thin sheet of gold foil. Now, if Thomson's theory of the atom was correct, these particles would pass right through the atoms, missing the electrons, and completely go right through the atom. However, when he ran his experiment, something else happened.
In 1910, Rutherford and his co-workers were studying the angles at which alpha particles were scattered as they passed through a thin gold foil. Most of the alpha particles passed through undeflected. However, a few were found to be scattered at large angles, some even back in the direction from which they had come. This meant that they had collided with an object much more massive than the alpha particles themselves, yet so small that only a few alpha particles encountered them. This atomic level view shows what is happening. Most of the atom is occupied by the low mass electrons. The nucleus is small and massive. When an alpha particle encounters a nucleus, it is scattered at a large angle.
From this, Rutherford came up with a new model for the atom. He said that most of the mass of an atom is a positive charge, that this is concentrated in a small region in the center of the atom, in which a term he borrowed from biology he called the nucleus of the atom. We now know that area as the proton. But if protons are positive and electrons are floating around are negative, why don't they attract each other and make the atom collapse on itself? Well, this was answered in 1913 by Niels Bohr, a graduate student of Rutherford's, who suggested that the electrons moved in concentric circles around the nucleus. So this is called the planetary model because the electrons circle around the nucleus in particular orbits.
Niels Bohr, who did postdoctoral work in Rutherford's lab, came up with an elegant solution to the collapsing atom problem. In a publication in 1913, Bohr suggested that the negatively charged electrons are found in concentric circular orbits around the positively charged nucleus, much like how the planets orbit the Sun. According to this model, the electrons are found at fixed energy levels, orbiting at fixed distances from the nucleus. The path closest to the nucleus has the lowest energy level, and the energy is generally higher the farther the orbits are from the nucleus. The farther a negatively charged electron is from the positively charged nucleus, the less attraction the electron feels. In the Bohr model, electrons are able to jump from one energy level to another, but they are not found between levels, much like how you have to take one entire step up or down a ladder, but you're never found standing between rungs.
However, around the same time Bohr came up with his theory, another scientist came up with a newer model. An Australian physicist and mathematical genius named Erwin Schrödinger came up with what we know as the quantum mechanical model of the atom. Now, I'm going to really simplify it because quantum mechanics is actually a whole division of physics, and we just want to know about the atom. So, Schrödinger realized that electrons don't move in perfect circles around the nucleus. Using wave and light theories from other scientists, he mathematically came up with a three-dimensional shape where the electrons can be found within about a 90% probability of being correct. These energy levels that Bohr used were now called orbitals, and each orbital had a particular shape. There are four types of orbitals: an s orbital, which is like a round sphere, a p orbital, which is like a dumbbell shape, a d orbital, which is similar to a four-leaf clover, and an f orbital, which is kind of like an eight-leaf clover, but it has some very odd shapes in it. So this model will explain a bit later in the course, but this is how the best representation of what an atom will look like today. So what do you need to remember from this? Well, 1. Democritus first came up with the atom theory back in 400 BC. You need to know Dalton's model of the atom and the four proposals that go with them. You need to know J.J. Thomson's discovered the electron using a cathode ray tube and his model of the atom was nicknamed the plum pudding model.
You need to know Rutherford's gold foil experiment, in which he discovered that the center of the atom was a dense positive center.
You need to know the Bohr model of the atom. You need to know that Schrödinger, or the quantum mechanical model, is a mathematically based model of the electron orbitals in an atom. One last thing you need to know is the timeline in chronological order. Which scientific discovery came first, then second, and then on. So know the model, the scientist, and any experiment they used to make their discovery. We'll see you in class.